Okay, let's try and unpack this. The headlines around global trade, especially, U.S. China, it can feel like a real head spinner sometimes.
Definitely. You see these reports maybe about China's economy being this juggernaut, unstoppable.
Right. And then the next minute, you're reading about how much the tariffs are actually, well, biting. It's
Oh,
confusing. You're left wondering what's really happening.
exactly. And there's this the significant gap, isn't there, between the narratives we hear often and the tangible economic effects we can actually see.
Yeah, the actual impact,
Yeah.
especially when you zero in on those U.S. tariffs and what they're doing to the U.S.-China trade dynamic.
Hmm.
So that's precisely the deep dive we're taking today. We want to cut through those sometimes contradictory analyses and narratives, especially those you might see in, say, Western media.
Get to the core of it.
Exactly. To really understand what these U.S. tariffs mean for this crucial relationship. Think of it as an essential briefing, especially relevant, I think, for our listeners, particularly UPSC aspirants navigating this really complex landscape of international relations and global economics.
Yeah, understanding these dynamics is key for current affairs.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to get past the noise, find some clarity.
And if we, connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
you've probably seen these portrayals of China's economy, right? Almost untouchable, incredibly resilient.
Yeah, that's one narrative.
But at the same time, there's this constant talk about the impact of U.S. trade policies. It's that clash, that apparent contradiction, that's really the first thing to explore here.
Right. These stories about an impregnable economy, that it can weather any storm. I've even seen suggestions that somehow Trump's tariffs actually benefit Xi Jinping.
That's a stretch based on the data?
Well, yeah, because if you look at the actual trade figures, the U.S. ran a massive deficit with China just last year, 2024. What was it, $295.4 billion?
That's a huge number.
It really is. A massive imbalance.
And that brings up a really fundamental economic point, doesn't it? Nations that run these big trade surpluses, like China, they ship over $400 billion worth of goods to the U.S. every year.
$400 billion.
Yeah. They generally find themselves, well, more vulnerable when trade wars kick off. They just have more skin in the game, more to lose if market access gets restricted.
Makes sense. And it's not like China is just sitting back unaware of this vulnerability, right? Our sources mention a kind of calculated narrative attack.
Yes, on American social media.
Exactly. Which is ironic, given those platforms are mostly blocked in China. But the aim seems to be sowing worry, uncertainty about U.S. policy.
Trying to influence the debate from the outside. And it seems to be, well, gaining some traction in certain places.
But despite all that narrative shaping, the sources we looked at are pretty clear. China is feeling the pinch.
Unequivocally, yes. Those Trump tariffs, they're substantial now. We're talking 145% on most goods.
145%.
And even higher on some specific items, up to 245%. That's a significant headwind for an economy so reliant on exports.
It's not just a small bump, is it? It's a massive barrier. And this is happening when China's already sort of grappling with this deflationary loop internally.
Exactly. You combine the tariffs with that deflation, it could genuinely trigger serious job losses, put real strain on local government finances too, which are already, facing pretty big debt issues.
It sounds like a really difficult position.
Well, what's fascinating, I think, is the tightrope China seems to be walking. The economic pressures are clearly building, but their political system, it's built on stability, projecting strength, especially under Xi Jinping. There's just very little room for showing any perceived weakness.
So unlike leaders in, say, more flexible systems, they can't easily just concede ground.
It carries huge political risks for the CCP. Publicly backing down in this kind of situation isn't really in their playbook.
Okay, so let's dig into the U.S. strategy then. These tariffs, they're not just random potshots, are they? There's a plan here.
Well, the source material describes them, particularly Trump's reciprocal tariffs, which, interestingly, are mostly suspended for nearly every other country except China, as an attempt at a kind of systemic reset.
A reset of global trade.
Yes. Now, it's definitely being done in a very distinctive style, you could say. Trumpian, as the source hints.
Right, with all the drama you might expect.
But beneath that surface, there seems to be a pretty clear objective decoupling, pushing for a separation of the American economy from China's.
Why, though? What's the thinking behind that?
Well, The rationale seems to be that China has gotten incredibly good at gaming the system of open trade that the U.S. largely shaped.
How so?
China's exports have just exploded, haven't they? Trading with 145 countries in 2023, that's up 50% since 2008. Huge growth.
Wow.
But at the same time, its own huge domestic market has stayed relatively closed off, less accessible to foreign competition.
So like masters of selling to the world, but maybe not so much buying from it, relatively speaking.
That's the perception, yes. And look, previous U.S. administrations saw this imbalance too, but they struggled to really counter it effectively.
And what's different now?
Trump's approach, as Zineb Berbua from the Hudson Institute puts it, seems to be a more fundamental challenge, an attempt to actually reset the rules of global trade itself, challenging China's model within the WTO framework.
Okay, so the tariffs aren't the whole story. They're just one piece of a bigger puzzle.
Absolutely. It's a broader strategy. Beyond tariffs, there's this coordinated push to reduce reliance on China by building stronger ties with other partners.
Right.
And that includes actively trying to clamp down on transshipment.
Transshipment, what's that exactly?
That's when Chinese goods are routed through third countries, think Mexico, Vietnam, to basically get around the U.S. tariffs.
Like a detour.
Precisely. So the U.S. is trying to stop that.
Yeah.
Plus, there's talk about synchronized taxes with allies, targeting specific Chinese raw materials. It's multifaceted.
It sounds quite comprehensive. The source even mentioned a pretty radical idea from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
Yes, the idea of systematically, removing China from the American economy, even potentially delisting Chinese stocks from U.S. exchanges.
Yes, that's a huge step.
It is. It signals just how deep the concerns run. And the Wall Street Journal reported the U.S. is actively lobbying, maybe persuading, over 70 other nations to block this transshipment.
70 nations.
Yeah, and discouraging Chinese firms from just setting up shop there purely to dodge the tariffs. If that works, even partially, it could really blunt China's ability to work around the tariffs.
Okay, so faced with all this pressure, how is China pushing back? They can't just be absorbing it all.
No, not at all. They've launched what's being called a diplomatic charm offensive.
A charm offensive.
Yeah.
That sounds different from the wolf warrior diplomacy we heard about before.
It does seem like a tactical shift. That more assertive style seems to be on hold for now anyway. Xi Jinping is being presented as more, affable.
Trying to build a coalition.
Exactly. Positioning China against what they call unilateral acts of bullying, which is clearly aimed at the U.S.
So reaching out to Europe, to ASEAN.
Precisely. She hosted the Spanish president recently, urging the EU to sort of join forces with China to defend globalization.
And is Europe biting?
Well, despite some, let's say, underlying skepticism, the EU is engaging. They've eased some regulations on Chinese EVs, planning a summit. So there's dialogue.
In Southeast Asia?
She also did a tour there, Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, trying to shore up those relationships, make sure they don't tilt too far towards the U.S. strategy of isolation.
What about India? There's a big trade imbalance there too, right?
Yes, and China has made overtures there as well, promises to address the surplus, buy more Indian goods.
Promises made.
But the source notes that while concrete actions haven't fully matched the rhetoric just yet, still waiting to see significant movement there.
And on the direct trade front, China's hitting back with its own tariffs.
Oh yes, retaliatory duties, up to 125% on various American products.
And are they targeted strategically?
Very much so. The source mentions targeting so-called red states, blocking things like U.S. natural gas, Boeing jets, beef, poultry, and crucially, restricting exports of rare earth minerals.
Ah, the rare earths. The U.S. depends on those.
Exactly. So the goal seems twofold. Hit industries in Trump's political base and exploit known U.S. dependencies on critical materials. It's strategic retaliation.
So, despite the outward confidence, the charm offensives,
Yeah.
are there real signs China's economy is under strain from all this?
The picture painted by the source is, quite concerning. The recent Canton Trade Fair, that's China's biggest export show.
Yeah.
The atmosphere was described as grim and complex. Apparently, organizers even had to warn exhibitors not to pack up early.
Really? That suggests worries about turnout or maybe businesses just leaving.
It could point to anxieties, yes,
Huh.
and what the exporters themselves were saying on the ground.
What were they reporting?
Many were saying the high U.S. tariffs just made selling to America impossible economically, not viable.
So orders being paused or canceled entirely.
Some reported exactly that. U.S. customers putting orders on hold or just stopping them completely. That's a huge blow for an economy so geared towards exports.
And we're even hearing about knock-on effects. Like factories may be closing in Southeast Asia?
Yes, because even those companies trying to use third countries, like Vietnam, to get around the tariffs are finding it riskier now, with the U.S. potentially cracking down on transshipment.
So the workarounds are getting squeezed too.
It seems so. And Reuters had projections. Pretty significant drops in Chinese exports to the U.S., maybe 30%, and overall exports down over 4.5%.
And what does that mean for overall growth?
That could translate to a drag of over a percentage point on China's GDP growth. That's not insignificant.
China's trying to boost domestic spending to make up for lost exports. Isn't that the plan?
That's the intended strategy, yes. But it's running into some serious headwinds.
Like what?
Well, for one, consumer prices are actually falling. That signals really weak domestic demand. Yes. And producer deflation, the prices manufacturers get, that's been going on for a long time now. Plus, you've got the troubled property sector.
Right. Real estate is huge for household welfare.
It is. Maybe 70% of family assets are tied up in it. So when that sector struggles, people feel poorer, less confident, and then there's the collapse of the shadow banking industry.
Less regulated finance.
Exactly. That's further hitting confidence in people's ability or willingness to spend.
So the plan to just switch to domestic demand isn't straightforward at all.
Far from it. The fundamental drivers just aren't firing. We're seeing major global banks like UBS revising their growth forecasts for China downwards.
And the tariffs are hurting manufacturers.
Especially those at the lower end, squeezing their already thin margins. Local governments are also strapped for cash, limiting their ability to step in with support.
And foreign investment.
Lowest levels in 3 decades, apparently. And confidence among China's own elite seems pretty shaken. Lots of stories of investors taking big hits.
It sounds like these economic pressures, they could potentially spill over into the political arena.
They certainly could. I mean, the CCP's legitimacy is so closely linked to delivering economic growth year after year.
So rising difficulties, job losses,
Yeah.
that could create discontent.
It has the potential to fuel internal dissent, yes. Which might explain, perhaps, the recent resurfacing of that old Mao Zedong quote.
Which one?
About not being afraid of provocations. You could read it as trying to project strength, mass underlying anxiety about the economic situation.
Right. So pulling all these threads together, this deep dive, drawing on our source from First Post, it really shows that, well, despite some conflicting headlines, this trade conflict is very real. It's having a major impact.
That's exactly right. It's not just rhetoric. Both the U.S. and China are facing real economic challenges because of this, although obviously their political systems, their ways of responding are quite different.
And hopefully, for our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, this discussion has offered some much needed clarity. It's such a critical, complex area for international relations, global economics, essential for daily UPSC mains current affairs prep.
And potentially useful for prelims, too, understanding these core dynamics.
Absolutely. It really brings up a key question to think about, doesn't it? Given how interconnected everything is. What are the longer-term ripple effects? This whole push towards decoupling, maybe shifting more to bilateral deals. Yeah. What does that mean for other countries, for the whole global economic order?
That's a huge question, and definitely something worth pondering, especially for those tracking international affairs for their UPSC preparation.
Indeed. So if you found this analysis helpful for understanding this crucial topic, maybe for your UPSC prep, please do like the show, subscribe if you haven't already.
And leave a comment if you have more questions. Let us know.
Yes, definitely. We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive into the U.S.-China trade complexities, drawing on the analysis from First Post.